Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Kaur. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society. This is our third session of Tennessee 101, the history of Tennessee music. So I'd like to go through a few brief housekeeping things here before we get started. If you want to sign up for any of our programs, please go to our website to the programs page. We have another session next week of our book club Tennessee Talks, where we'll be discussing a court case that involved Pat Summitt and the Oak Ridge High School girls basketball team. It was a case that led to Tennessee being forced to allow girls to actually use the entire court to play basketball. So we'll have both of the authors of that book joining us, and Dr. Carol Busey will be our moderator for that. We have one more session of Tennessee 101 in November. That session will be devoted to Mexican music in Tennessee. And then we'll finish up this series of lectures with another session of Tennessee Talks, where we'll be discussing the deep past of Nashville, archaeology, with Dr. Aaron Dieter and Dr. Tanya Perez. If you want to, you can explore more about the topics that we're discussing. Each of the pages devoted to each session has a little link on it called resources, and that will take you to the Padlet, which is a fancy way of saying online cloud storage. And you can go here to find playlists or a bibliography or posts, links. We can find all sorts of cool stuff there, including the websites for our two presenters tonight. All of our past sessions have been recorded. If you missed any of them, please feel free to go back and take a look at them. Now tonight, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end to discuss them. If you want to follow us on social media, I would encourage you to do so. That's the best way of finding about upcoming programs. I do want to thank our major sponsors for this, Humanities Tennessee and the Tennessee Arts Commission. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put on these presentations. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Sean Pitts, who is one of the moderators of Tennessee 101, and he's going to introduce our participants and our presenters for this evening. Sean, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's so great to be here. Great to be with Tennessee Historical Society doing these sessions. We've had a great time thus far, and tonight's not going to be an exception to that. Howard Armstrong is probably better known to many Tennesseans by his stage name, Louie Bluie, and he is, in my opinion, an unsung hero of Tennessee music. Maybe unsung is the wrong choice of words, since La Follette, Tennessee hosts an annual festival in his honor. That was just a couple of weeks ago, and Howard was the recipient of an NEA National Heritage Fellowship, as well as the Tennessee Governor's Arts Awards Folklife Heritage Award. So though he has been heralded as kind of the exemplar of black string band traditions, that label fails to really take in the full scope of who Howard Armstrong was and what he represented as an artist. And I can think of no one better to shed light on the brilliant and in many ways kind of enigmatic career of Howard Armstrong than this evening's two esteemed presenters, Elijah Wald and Dom Flemons, I'm sorry. Elijah has been playing music since he was a kid and writing about it since the early 1980s. His books include Escaping the Delta, which is a history of blues focused on Robert Johnson, The Mayor of McDougal Street, that's Dave Van Ronk's memoir, and the inspiration for the Coen brothers Inside Llewyn Davis. Dylan Goes Electric is another title he's written, as well as How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, which I highly recommend. And just for variety, he's written books on insults, hitchhiking, and Mexican drug ballads. As a musician, he's performed on 5 continents, made a couple of records, and played for 5 years with Howard Armstrong, who's the subject of our discussion this evening. We had a little trouble with the Zoom getting Dom logged in, but I think he's in now, and so I'm going to go ahead and introduce him as well. Dom Flemons is a Grammy Award winner and 2-time Emmy Award nominee. He's a songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, producer, actor, music scholar, historian, and record collector. In 2020, Dom was selected for the prestigious United States Artists Fellowship Award for the traditional arts, and he's been a governor on the board of directors for the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Recording Academy. Dom's prestigious awards and accolades are too numerous really to mention, as are his many recordings and appearances. I do, however, want to point out several of Dom's critically acclaimed solo music projects. American Songster, from which Dom derives his favorite moniker, the 2020's Prospect Hill, and 2018's Black Cowboys on Smithsonian Folkways label. All are relatively recent releases, and you can check those out. For purposes of this session, it's probably important to mention that Dom is a co-founder of the Grammy Award-winning Carolina Chocolate Drops, who, if I'm not very much mistaken, were named in honor of Howard Armstrong's first group, the Tennessee Chocolate Drops. And I know Dom has drawn significant inspiration from Howard as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our two presenters this evening, Dom Flemons and Elijah Wald.
Glad to be here. Dom, looks like you need to unmute. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here as well. You know, so good to see you, Elijah. So good to see you, Dr. Pitts, and it's a pleasure to be here as a part of this talk. I mean, there's so many ways we can go with Howard Armstrong. He was such a multifaceted person. I mean, I guess let's start with your connection to him, since you got to know him and play with him for several years. How did you meet Howard? And kind of for folks that don't know anything about him, what can we say to put him in context of the musical world we love so well, of roots music?
Boy, that's hard. I actually met him when he was on the Smithsonian Fiddle Tour. They had, you know, jazz. I forget who the whole group was, but I mean, they had jazz fiddler, Irish fiddle, Michael Doucette.
Oh, yeah.
Alison Krauss was on that one. She was, I think, 16 at the time.
Wow.
And I just happened, Utah Phillips was staying with me and happened to be invited to it. And I went along with Utah, and we ended up sitting next to Howard and his not yet wife at that moment, Barbara Ward. And Barbara Ward had worked at Harvard University and knew my parents and had actually been over at our house. So she was like, "Oh, I remember you when you were this tall." And so that was how I met him. And then I ran into them in Boston Common, and he said he was putting together a band. And I said, "Oh, well, I'd be interested in auditioning, and I have a bass player." And I think they were wary, but we went over to their place and it worked out. And we played with them for the next 5 years.
Oh, that's amazing. And that was Howard's last 5 years of his
No, there was one more band after us. My bass player was not always on time, and it made them nervous. So we sort of for a while alternated, and then some other guys came in as well. Really good players, actually. But it was interesting. It was amazing playing with him. I was just telling this story to Dr. Pitts. You know, I went over, I think, with a little bit of the idea that he was more of like a folk musician. And we started in the first rehearsal, and we were doing Lady Be Good, and we got to the bridge, and he said, "No, that should be an augmented seventh chord."
Wow.
And I was like, "Okay, can you show me how to play an augmented seventh chord?" And he took the guitar from me and showed me how to play an augmented seventh chord and explained the theory behind it. I mean, he was, you know, there are a lot of the old time musicians who, when you got together with them, you know, they'd say this one is in E flat, meaning E minor or whatever. Howard was not one of those guys.
Wow.
I mean, Howard was a guy who, you know, if he said, "Okay, what do you want to play?" "Oh, let's play Sweet Georgia Brown." "Fine, what key do you want to play it in? What key are you comfortable in?" He'd just look and go, "They're all on the fiddle." And he meant it. You called Sweet Georgia Brown in E flat. He didn't play open strings, so he didn't care where the hell it was on the fiddle or mandolin. It was all the same to him. No, terrific musician.
Yeah, and part of this very unique generation in the way that, I guess, his recording career, when was that Knoxville session? What was that, 1930, I think, 1929?
He recorded in 30 and again in 34. Yeah, in 30 on fiddle, and then I guess 34 on mandolin.
And that's when he was playing with Ted Bogan in the State Street Rag. That or is that?
Yeah, that's the 34 one.
Okay, great. And because, you know, I guess one of the things I try to explain to people a lot of times is how ragtime string band music developed. You know, I always try to explain it as ragtime developed out of a somewhat a Euro classical tradition of piano playing, incorporating string band music and early African American melodies into its framework, I guess. And then I guess by the time we get to Howard, we see not only ragtime become a part of American popular music, it kind of spills back into folk tradition and then kind of reverberates into kind of a almost like a super genre of music where kind of like ragtime is played fast. You're playing folk melodies, but you're also using quite complex harmonic structures. And I guess
yeah, I mean, like all this stuff, it's so messy. I mean, if I had to do the origin, I probably would say that ragtime started actually with African American banjo playing, and that the piano is actually layering on top of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that, you know, what we think of as country ragtime, a lot of it was probably around before the piano stuff. And then it fed into the piano stuff, and that fed back into the, you know, it goes back and forth forever.
Yeah. Well, because Howard is, I mean, he's the exemplar of the exchange between folk tradition and popular music tradition in many ways. I mean, my introduction, of course, was through the DVD Louie Bluie by Terry Zwigoff, which I mean is a fantastic film. And also anybody who's interested in sort of the raw and ruckus nature of string band music and Howard himself, I mean, it's the perfect film for that. I mean, I don't know.
And with the cartoons and everything, I mean, he was an incredible artist. He actually made his living a lot of the time doing artwork, doing visual art.
Yeah, you know, it was interesting even that Robert Cogswell sent down a nice little document that he mentions in passing that Howard may have studied at the Tennessee State Normal School.
Yeah.
And he was actually there for art, not music. And so, I mean, of course, the DVD, I always tell people to get the Criterion because, you know, thankfully we get for the first time a reproduction of some of Howard's actual artwork, you know. I mean, and over the years, he left so much art behind. You know, every once in a while I run into a gig where someone says, hey, well, you know who did this? Bam. And
yeah, no, I'm wearing my Howard Armstrong medallion.
Oh, wow.
He used to make these things, and people would come up and say, so are those lucky? He'd say, sure are lucky for me every time I sell one.
And also, I mean, maybe speak a word about Howard's, I don't want to just say jive, because it's a state of mind and a state of being to be able to have a word of phrase or a joke, and also since you wrote the book, The Dozens, what can we say about Howard in terms of that, in terms of his speaking style?
Oh, he was a very, very funny man. And he also, you know, he was pretty much always the smartest person in the room. And he was aware of that. But I mean, there were things he would do. You know, we were mostly playing in front of white audiences. And there were things he would sort of do as jokes around the character they thought he was. I mean, when he would do a hymn, say, this was a song, this was a favorite of my mother's. She's gone on to heaven now. And he'd sort of look up and then he'd look down and say, at least that's where she said she was going, and I haven't seen her since. And the whole audience is like, oh, look at it. And then they're just like, okay, right. No, he was a master of the put on. He was wonderful.
Oh, that's wonderful. Now, would you say that that's something that is deep within his tradition as someone coming out of Tennessee? I feel like there's always a word of phrase or some type of joke, especially within country and Western music in general. And of course, we're talking about Howard. There are these cross sections with I guess more standard mainstream white country music that Howard tended to flip on its head, or he did this musically as well as
he had that. He also was a very literate guy. I mean, he read a lot. So, I mean, you know, he was picking stuff up from all over the place. I mean, also just musically, you know, he had a whole evening set worth of Polish music. He had a full set of Italian music. because people forget this. You know, in his area, Tennessee, the mines and to an extent the agriculture was largely being worked by recent immigrants. And so he was playing gigs of Italian music, gigs of Polish music, which he learned in Tennessee, in rural Tennessee. But he used to say that's actually what saved him when he was up in Chicago when the Depression came. And he said it got really tough, but he could always play all the Italian bars because they'd walk in. He said, you know, they'd walk in this bunch of black guys and the Italians would be like that. And then he'd start talking Italian to them and they'd go completely nuts and he'd start singing Italian songs.
Wow. And that's amazing because, of course, he was a master of how many languages? He
used to say 7. How many he actually spoke, I don't know. And I mean, he used to do a version of Chinatown, My Chinatown, which he claimed to sing in English and Mandarin Chinese. And I'm dubious. But he did speak Spanish. I mean, I spoke Spanish with him. If we have the time, I'm going to play a little of his version of La Cucaracha. And I mean, he not only sang it in Spanish, he could improvise lines to add in.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he spoke French. He did his French blues, and that was real. I don't know how good his other languages were because I don't speak anything more than those.
Oh, and that's amazing, though, that especially as a functional musician, it's very interesting to think about him being able to transcend and code switch far beyond just, you know, usually when we think of African American musicians code switching, we think of white and black, but to think of the world of code switching being much more multifaceted and of
Absolutely. You know, just something, I'm going to ask you to play some music in just a minute, but I've been doing a Jelly Roll Morton project and I was listening to all these interviews they have down in New Orleans. And at the Hogan Jazz Archive, they have a bunch of interviews with Alice Zeno, who was George Lewis's mother, and who was old enough. She was in her 90s when they were interviewing her. And they have one interview in English, and then they realized she was more comfortable in French and switched into French. But she was also 100% fluent in German.
Wow.
Because she had, as a young girl, gotten a job working for a German immigrant family. So she was completely fluent in German. No, and people forget how many Black people in the South, just because, you know, they're working in all these different environments, you know, it's like any third world country. I mean, you know, you go anywhere in Africa, any market woman is going to speak 5 languages.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I mean, we forget that, you know, people who live in oral cultures, it's not that they're not educated. A lot of them are, you know, very, very multilingual in oral cultures.
Absolutely. And then knowing that the line all the way from New Orleans to Chicago is such a straight shot too, it's interesting to think that Howard was able to take these skills with him to Chicago and again, very segregated parts of the city or places that were very ethnically specific and be able to use those skills in whatever form he needed. Again, for entertainment, there's always a little bit of a leniency when someone is able to entertain for a full night. And it's amazing that Howard use that to his full advantage. But yeah, let's. Do you mind playing a little number? I know we should play at least a little music because Howard goes in a million directions.
Let me play one of Howard's. This is he didn't write a lot of full-scale songs. He wrote pieces of things, but this is one he wrote that's sort of his masterpiece, the Barnyard Dance.
Oh, wonderful! And he recorded this one on Rounder Records, I believe, right? Or
Flying with Martin Bogan and Armstrong. pale moonlight, all the vegetables had a spree. They put up a sign, said the dance was at 9, and all the admission was free. They had peas and greens, cabbage and beans. It was the greatest sight you ever seen. And when old man Cucumber struck up his number, you ought to hear the vegetables scream. Now the little turnip top did the backward flop. Cabbage tried to shimmy, he could not stop. Well, little red beet shook his feet, and the watermelon died with a cockeyed heat. You know, a little tomato agitator, well, he shook up a shimmy with a sweet potato. An old man garlic dropped dead with a colic. He was down at the barnyard dance in the morning, at the barnyard dance. Down at the barnyard dance in the morning, down at that barnyard dance.
Yeah. All right. The barnyard dance. I mean, what a wonderful number there. And you got to play that with Howard, I'd imagine. He would play fiddle.
Oh, we did that at every show. Now, he mostly played that one on fiddle. I mean, he played both fiddle and mandolin, but that one was a fiddle one. Nice. You had some fiddle tunes, only you were going to play them on harmonica, right?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things I wanted to mention in passing with sort of the string band tradition, as we're talking about it, one of the parts of the tradition I found so interesting is that innovations of jazz start to creep into the string band tradition, whether it's overt influences or whether it's a very jazzy version of a number. I mean, that's something that I feel is a part of it. And of course, Buford Bailey, one of the things I love about his recorded works as a harmonica player is that he has a combination of old time numbers on the harmonica that he translated over. And you find out his grandfather was a fiddler and it carried down through tradition. But then also he has tunes like the Fox Chase, which I think are built on the innovations of Quill's playing. And then also you just have a couple of popular tunes as well, which end up in his repertoire, which I always think are it's just very interesting to think of the conjecture of where people's repertoires are landing. Of course, the Old Hen Cackle is one of the numbers that I've always enjoyed because I mean, it's one of the things that actually led me into Howard's music as well. Again, mentioning the Louie Bluie movie, can't mention this enough to everybody. When you see him playing the cackling hen, there's a structure for the chords and the form of the song, but the third part is sort of where you have to mimic the sound of the hen cackling, or you do just a little extra musical part. So I'm going to do a little bit for you now. So first part, you have...
Nice.
And
yeah,
I'll mention also with Robert Cogswell, I want to just mention this is actually a little house cleaning thing. He wrote to Elijah and I and mentioned a couple of extra facts about Louie Bluie he was able to find, but he mentions just in passing, he says, as your presentation places Howard and black string bands into the larger context of Tennessee history, I hope you'll mention to the audience that the Tennessee Folklore Society has encouraged documentation of black string band music in the state in a series of articles, recordings, and lectures in recent decades. These efforts listed below are identified by some of the field's outstanding Tennessee players in their day, although many others surely remain unnoted in the writing of local history. And I mention that because back when I was in Arizona, I had found out about D. Ford Bailey, but there were no recordings available. I mean, it was only the Document Records Heart Blowers, which I couldn't find. Again, this is before eBay, everybody. So, you know, you had to call your local stores to find them. But I eventually found a copy of the Tennessee Folklore Society's D. Ford Bailey, country music's first black star, this wonderful compilation collection of David Morton's personal recordings of D. Ford Bailey. And of course, with the cackling hymn, he actually explains how he does that little harmonica effect and mentions the teeth and how you work a harmonica and how you can take care of them. So it was a great education to first hear his harmonica playing more extensively than maybe your one or two recordings of the Pan American Express or the Fox Chase. But also it allowed his thoughts on harmonica, and then also featured a couple of guitar numbers as well as banjo numbers. And to hear D. Ford Bailey playing a left-handed guitar in almost like Elizabeth Cotten, I mean, it's especially that Lost John on the banjo. It's amazing to hear the deep well of tradition that he was drawing from. And I think of Howard in that same way, where he is the modern and the ancient don't seem to have they're not really distinct from one another. They can be modified and evoked at the same moment almost sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, his concerts, he would cover the whole range of stuff that he enjoyed. And I mean, that was really important to him. You know, there was a period after Ted Bogan died, it was very hard for him because Bogan was essentially the accompanist he had trained to work with him and could follow everything he did. And when Bogan died, for a while, the arts societies, you know, Smithsonian, were matching him up with other older Black guitar players. And they didn't play the augmented seventh chord. You know, a lot of them were blues players.
Yeah.
And Howard got very upset about that, that they were, you know, putting him together with people who, it didn't bother him that they didn't play what he played. It bothered him that they were people who weren't interested in learning what he played. What bothered him was not that somebody couldn't play an augmented seventh. It was that when he said that's supposed to be an augmented seventh, mentioning no names, the accompanist they had set him up with would say, "You play your instrument, I'll play mine." Howard repeated this over and over. He said, "I'm trying to tell you how to play your instrument." But interesting what you were saying. I actually should use this opportunity to speak to the world out there at large, because there's something I'm in search of. Because someone, I thought from the Smithsonian, but they say it wasn't them, came out and filmed Howard for an hour and a half or 2 hours with Paul Jeremiah doing the interviewing. And it was for some historical society, and he played his version of Stardust. And Howard had a solo guitar instrumental arrangement of Stardust that was the most gorgeous thing ever, and he never performed it. It was, you know, strictly for like sitting quietly at home, and never recorded it. And I know this film exists, so if anyone out there knows where this might be, please tell me.
This is the hidden gem, just like I think about the documentary on Chuck Berry, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll. The last moment in the credits, when we see slowly the camera pans to Chuck Berry playing this beautiful pedal steel solo. It's, you know, you wonder, that deep well that, you know, because also a lot of people don't know that Howard played guitar. And you had mentioned there was a particular number he played that connects him, of course, to Martin, Bogan, and Armstrong. I think it was Good Morning Judge you may have mentioned. Or yeah,
I actually think of it as Crow Jane, but because Martin used the same arrangement for a whole bunch of different songs. But yeah, it was, I of course, you know, you should be doing it because you can do the tremolo fast enough. I can't do it. Say good morning how do you do? Say good morning, Judge. Say, Judge, how do you do? Well, you know, I just stopped by to have a few words with you. I said, oh, dear sweet judge, now won't you listen to my plea? I said, now, dear sweet judge, you listen to my plea. Well, all I'm asking, won't you bring my baby back to me? And I didn't know, I would not have gone up there. I had worked it out like, or something. I forget how I'd worked it out. And then I saw Howard doing it, and he's like.
Yeah, what I usually end up doing, I take it on that first fret.
Yeah, that's how I would have done it.
Yeah,
but you did it up here.
And that's one of the beautiful parts of the whole guitar vocabulary. You know, in recent months, I've been talking a lot about Arnold Schultz with people. Arnold
Sure.
Schultz, an itinerant musician who influenced Bill Monroe. But as you get into his story, you find that not only as a fiddler is he influencing Bill Monroe, but you find that his guitar style influences people like Tex Atchison, who was part of the Kentucky Ramblers, who became the Prairie Ramblers, and helped form Western Swing as we know it. Also Merle Travis and Chet Atkins.
I was about to say Merle Travis, yeah.
And so I've had a lot of discussions with people. I think maybe it would be wonderful to just kind of talk about this a little bit. Passing chords, you know, one of the articles by Keith Lawrence talking about Arnold Schultz mentions that when Schultz added the 1-6-2-5, the A chord from "I'll See You in My Dreams," it changed the county, you know. And I think about how just chord changes. Again, just to kind of give context, you know, a lot of times for folks that may not be fully musically aware, a lot of string band numbers are just one chord. So as the guitar accompaniment, you're just banging on one chord. You might throw a second chord in there somewhere. But when you start to get into the world of guitar in the early 1920s and 30s, you start having passing chords and little sort of walkarounds. Like when I worked with Boo Hanks, I always loved playing his version of Keep On Truckin' because it had the syncopation that he used to do, like. And then you could do. And so he used to kind of do things like that. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that, the sort of the passing chords that end up becoming a part of string band and folk music, and how that is, you know, Howard used these passing chords for everything. I think that's.
I mean, it's interesting because I never learned to play like Bogan. But Bogan was the master of that, and not just on folk stuff. I mean, Bogan literally would play a different chord on every single beat when he was doing those things. And he was into ninth chords. I mean, his thing was, but no, I mean, it's what you're saying is exactly right. And a lot of it is just, you know, people were playing what they heard.
Yeah.
And they sometimes came up with very complex variations. And, you know, I think a lot of what we hear as passing chords, in some cases, they're not even thinking that way. They're just thinking beyond chords. You know, they're thinking of whatever feels right. But if you think of it in chordal terms, it's much more complicated than if you just played like the standard chords.
Well, like even with that Keep On Truckin', this part on the break, you know, usually you would play maybe the 1, then the 7th, then 4, then you go up to the 2, and then run back
Right.
to one. But when Boo played it, because I was watching him at one point because I was backing him up. He had described this to me as just hitting those two notes, but hit it open. So he did. And then would run it back to the one, but he said you don't. He'd say, "Don't play any other notes. Just hit those two notes, and that's your chord." Which I found was a hard augmented chord that I learned from Boo directly just with that, and it was interesting. That was how he heard. He heard that was the change and formed the arrangement around that. And
yeah, no, I mean, like Mississippi John Hurt was one of the masters of that. I mean, John Hurt plays all these things that are not the standard chords, but they work beautifully.
Yeah.
Howard was not so much that kind of player. I mean, it's interesting. Howard was a more, in one way, more, I suppose I could say more educated player.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he played, what he wanted from a guitarist was more the textbook chords.
Yeah, because
And
he could read music, I'd imagine, and
I don't know if he read music. I mean, he certainly, he very likely could, you know, New Orleans, they talk about readers and spellers.
Yeah.
And, you know, the readers were the guys who you could put them in an orchestra and put a sheet in front of them and they'd play it.
Mm-hmm.
The spellers were guys who couldn't do that, but if you gave them a sheet of music, they could work out what it said.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm a speller and I think he was a speller, but I never knew him to use written music.
Oh. Okay.
But he knew all the chords. And I mean, he really knew them. And he knew what he wanted. And that was I mean, there were passing chords, and I don't remember them. I actually have them written down because he wrote them all out for me at one point.
Wow.
But I mean, he knew exactly what he wanted, and he wanted it that way.
Mm.
No, he was a very varied and interesting musician. In fact, let me play another thing of his. This, especially because I understand that the next program coming up is Tennessee Mexican music.
Oh, lovely.
So it's appropriate to play Howard's version of La Cucaracha. It'll think of this as promoting the next thing in this series, which as far as I know, he wrote the English lyric to this that he uses, but it's based off the Spanish. He sang one verse, which is the verse about the baker going to the mass and praying to the Virgin Mary in the usual version to bring him marijuana. Howard didn't sing it that way, though he did sing marijuana in the chorus. But I think Howard then went off the baker thing and did his own little baker fantasy in English. La cucaracha ya no puede caminar porque no tiene, porque le falta marihuana que fumar. Y singing, la cucaracha ya no puede caminar porque no tiene, porque le falta marihuana que fumar. Un panadero fue a misa, no encontrando que rezar, pidió a la Virgen pura un dinero para fumar. Un panadero fue a misa, no encontrando que rezar, le pidió a la Virgen pura un dinero para fumar. The little cockroach, he's running all around the house. The little cockroach, la cucaracha, he He's quiet as a little mouse. You know he gets in trouble, looking here, there, and everywhere. Well, that little cockroach always leaves the cupboard bare. Well, one day when they were baking, he went to see what they were making, because it looked so appetizing to see the dough there softly rising. Up to the edge he went skipping, but then he felt himself a-slipping into the batter, hot and blazing, and now he's just another raisin.
Oh, that's a great version.
Yeah, no, he was a wonderful man.
Oh, that's amazing. And of course, again, I've mentioned Louie Bluie, the documentary film. There's also a second film, Sweet Old Song, which talks about his marriage and his later years with Barbara Ward. And I got a chance to meet Barbara when, by the time the Carolina Chocolate Drops had started, she would come to the shows, and we actually went over to Howard's big tombstone that he had, his great headstone over in Massachusetts. Actually, when we were over at the Africa Meeting House, we did a gig, and then went over to Howard's headstone. And
I should actually mention, in terms of the breadth of Howard's music, I should mention his son Ralph.
Oh yes, we're talking about jazz. It would be amazing to continue to see how. I think of when I think of Howard's mind as you're talking about it, it's like what Thelonious Monk thought in his head. Even though Thelonious is doing piano, Howard's a fiddle version of that in some way, constantly innovating.
And I mean, in Howard's context, a lot of us think of Ralph as the guy who played some bass on Howard's records, but Ralph played in the Mahavishnu Orchestra with John McLaughlin. I mean, Ralph was a monster, is a monster bass player.
Yeah.
Of the most advanced jazz level. And he starts with his dad, and he was always happy to accompany his dad, and he played great behind his dad. He also could do the whole Mahavishnu Orchestra thing. I mean, it carried on in the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think of musical tradition continuing. And again, this is a vocabulary in which you draw upon, where melodies can be bent and changed into something much more broad and far out there. Especially, I think about it. Yeah, Mahavishnu Orchestras is that's the innovation moving way into the future.
And Howard was very proud of that Ralph was doing that. You were going to play some banjo for us as well.
Yeah, let me get a little bit here just to kind of show syncopation. We were talking about ragtime. Let me see. Sorry for the dramatic angle. This is a tackhead banjo that was made by Jeffrey Menzies in Jamaica. And a lot of when I'm playing these types of numbers, here I'll do a little bit of one, Tough Luck. This is one that comes from Clarence Ashley. And this is one that I spoke with Joe Thompson, who of course I sat with for many years with the Chocolate Drops. Joe used to mention that his uncles played this song, and his uncles had been born back in the 1880s, and so I had learned it. And then I kind of put it down for a while, and then I picked it up again just recently, especially as I had this tackhead banjo. But this is kind of a pre-blues form.
Every man gets in tough luck sometime. Every man gets in tough luck sometime. But I'll be lucky some old day. If I lose, let me lose, I don't care. If I lose, let me lose, I don't care. But I'll be lucky some old day. when the sun goes down. I'll be laughing when the sun goes down. But I'll be lucky some old day. Take your time, I'm weary, take your time. Take your time, I'm weary, take your time. But I'll be lucky some old day.
Nice.
Yeah, and that was a little number that I heard Clarence Ashley do it. I heard a recording of Clarence Ashley and John Watson, and over time I found that I was able to adapt it, especially on that low tone banjo. You know, one of the things I've been finding out recently is one of the hidden chapters of the banjo's history is the way that as pianos came in, they began to create banjos in the Industrial Revolution, and it changed the whole key system in which banjos were being played. So it's even interesting to see that where you place your chords, the tones of your notes, and how it fit with your melody were very fluid at one point. I find that very interesting, especially when we think of Howard and his sort of era of coming of age in this early turn of the 20th century, where music is just fluctuating from 440 as we know to a lot of different key systems even.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you mentioned Tom Ashley. I mean, this is something obviously you know better than anybody, but I mean, so much of the music that, because of the way the recording industry worked, people think of as white Southern music, was Black Southern music, or was shared Southern music. I mean, I love that story. When I went with Howard down to Augusta and that's actually, I think, where I first met John Jackson.
Mm.
And I had heard a story about John Jackson that when someone mentioned DeFord Bailey to him and said, yeah, you must remember DeFord Bailey. He was on the only Black star of the Grand Ole Opry. That John Jackson said, what are you talking about? What about Uncle Dave Macon? And it had never occurred to him that Uncle Dave Macon wasn't Black.
Mm. Yeah,
I mean, he was called Uncle Dave, like Uncle Tom and Uncle Ben, and he was playing all the stuff the old Black men played when John was growing up. And it simply hadn't occurred to him that this might not be an old Black man.
Mm.
And people forget that, not only were those traditions going back and forth and white musicians adapting from Black musicians, but people hearing this stuff on records and on the radio, they didn't know. I mean, people didn't know that Vine Street Drag was a Black fiddler, and that, Tom Ashley was a white guy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's in fact why a lot of the Black fiddlers never got recorded, because the recording companies thought of that as white music. So I remember when Kirk and Sam McGee were interviewed, and they said, oh yeah, that fiddle style, that was Black fiddlers when we were growing up. And people said, well, what happened to them? And Kirk said, nothing happened to them. I still know 11 Black fiddlers out in the area around Nashville. Just nobody was recording them.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when we think about that, there's been a lot of great research. Well, again, we lament the fact that Black string bands weren't recorded as frequently. One of the things that I find so amazing with technology and access to music, we can actually cobble together quite a sizable amount of variety out of the Black string band tradition of what was recorded, which I think is really great. Everything from Jim and Andrew Baxter, who have a really smooth style of playing, to the field recordings of Gribble, Lusk, and York, or Nathan Frazier and Frank Patterson. Again, Springfield Records, looking at you guys with the John Wesley Work III compilation. And it's amazing to see that over the past several years, a lot of information has come out. Of course, I also, Robert Cogswell also reminded me of Linda Henry's wonderful website dedicated to Gribble, Lusk, and York, who lived just a stone's throw away from Howard in a certain way. And it's just amazing to be able to hear all the different styles. And of course, I think about people like the Nashville Washboard Band, who recorded with Alan Lomax in the early 40s. Wald had a straight ahead string band. They featured this rapid fire banjo mandolin and this beautiful washboard sound, which it takes us into what would be the next I guess the next iteration of street music in the Black community. Of course, Blind Boy
Sure.
Fuller then takes over, and a different type of washboard-driven guitar music grows.
Sure, and I mean, all those guys around Mississippi and Memphis with the Mississippi Sheiks and that whole thing, who, I mean, now I'm forgetting his name, the mandolin player who plays on the Tommy Johnsons, Charlie McCoy, who he used to play with Howard, and he apparently had, again, he had the whole Italian repertoire and the whole swing band repertoire. He was another of those guys who could play anything.
And
what we have is the blues.
Yeah, and it's amazing.
But
yeah.
he could do anything.
Yeah,
and a lot of those guys, they were professionals.
Yeah.
And people, because there was so much segregation, people forget the fact that musicians crossed a lot of those lines. I mean, I have a friend who interviewed, Robert Jr. Lockwood. And asked him, so, was it strange for you when the folk revival happened and suddenly you were playing for all these audiences of white people? And Robert Jr. looked at him and went, who do you think we were playing for in Mississippi? That they were the ones who had the money.
Yeah.
Which is why Muddy Waters when they found him, had a whole repertoire of Gene Autry numbers. Though that was also there was a huge Black audience for cowboy music and for country music. It works both ways.
And I can think of a wonderful story I saw actually of Solomon Burke, actually, with his very first hit, Just Out of Reach of My Two Loving Arms, which most everybody's heard.
Empty Arms.
But the fact that you find the story that he, of course, loved Gene Autry, but since it was on Starday Records, the original version, Solomon Burke actually had to go to Gene Autry's office and ask the man himself if he could cover Just Out of Reach. And I mean, what an amazing story to think about. Is again, when we think of the segregation and the separation of Black and white musicians, these amazing stories that show us that music transcends, of course, and of course Howard again is just one of those wonderful musicians who was able to bring all of these different styles together. But it looks like we're getting close to the end of our time. I did see one question that said, Howard Armstrong is a member of a pretty small group of artists, blues mandolin musicians. Why aren't there more? And what do you have to do to have more around? I
think the short answer to that is, if there was a market for them, there would have been thousands of them. I mean, there were lots of people. Every fiddler who ever lived, if there was money in a mandolin gig, they could play mandolin. It's tuned exactly the same way. I think there just wasn't much demand. And again, that's partly the string band thing. I mean, people typed blues as piano and guitar music. And so you didn't get a lot of recordings of blues on mandolin or on accordion, or, concertina. I mean, when blues came in, you got to remember, in the old days, a band for a dance was whoever lived in the neighborhood and could play instruments. And if the people who lived in the neighborhood happened to be an accordion player, a harmonica player, a trombone player, and a banjo player, that was the band that night. And if the audience said, we want to dance a blues for the next number, they played a blues. And if the audience said, now we want a waltz, they played a waltz. That was how it worked. And if we don't have it recorded, that's about the recording engineers and producers, not about the musicians. The musicians could play whatever people asked them to play. That was the gig.
Absolutely, and I'll mention an exciting series of recordings from the box set of Black Europe, which came out a few years back. There was some wonderful mandolin, again, not blues mandolin, from Silas Meeks, I believe was his name, but he was an extraordinary mandolinist who played a series of Georgia at a Georgia camp meeting, which is a well-known ragtime number, as well as a series of classical type numbers. So the mandolin sort of had a transitionary period where we we're fortunate we have the few people, Johnny Young and
Johnny Young, Charlie McCoy.
and of course Yank Rochelle, and of course reading his autobiography is another window into his mind as a musician. But anyway, I know we're running out of time. I see Dr. Pitts and Jennifer are giving us the high sign.
Well, we have a few questions if you all can stick around a little bit. One is about Howard's book. Where is it and who's got it? It was featured in Louie Bluie, and Howard said he kept the book locked up. I don't know.
We're talking about, We're talking about the Whorehouse Bible.
Oh.
It was an absolutely filthy object. And Terry Zwigoff, the director of the film, ended up with it. I believe there was an attempt to publish it. The problem was a lot of it was cut and paste from magazines, as well as Howard's own work. He did these incredible collages. But the problem of that is, if you want to publish it, you need the rights for all of the images. And it was a messy situation. But I hope someday it gets published. It's absolutely filthy from beginning to end, but a magnificent piece of work.
Just for folks who may not know if they haven't seen the film, this is a small book that Howard shows in the movie, where he talks about his philosophy of life through the secular, the sacred, and the vulgar. And I mean, the film just is a perfect little preview to just make you wonder what's the rest of it, because there's some really, really funny and very insightful pieces to it.
Yeah, I mean, when I first met him, Joe, what was his name, who ran the Smithsonian concert series? Joe
No.
Wilson.
Oh,
Joe
Wilson.
Wilson, thank you. Yeah, when I first met him, he had, that morning, Howard had slipped a cartoon under Joe Wilson's door that I not only can't describe it, I can't even tell you the general theme of it. But suffice it to say, I'm sure Joe Wilson treasured it, and you are not going to be showing it in this historical society.
No, probably not. Probably not.
Well, as we're wrapping up, I have dozens of questions, but I'll have to fire those off by email as we're getting close here. I'm glad you mentioned Yank Rochelle, who's somebody that I admire from over in my neck of the woods. But as we wrap up, both of you talk a little bit about upcoming events or things you'd like to share with us that you have on your agenda coming up.
You got some stuff, Dom?
Yeah, I mean, the most exciting thing I've had going is this banjo that I was playing here during the presentation. This is a special banjo, the American Songster Tackhead banjo. So we made a limited run of 10 of these banjos. It's features blue Mahoe wood on the neck, as well as Jamaican maple for the body, and that's been really exciting. So I got that about a month ago. So again, if you think of the banjo as being a high-pitched instrument, to have it kind of go to the range of slap bass almost, in a way, I like to think of things like that. It's quite a wonderful new door that's opening up for how I'm playing old-time banjo, 5-string banjo, and also first time with a fretless instrument. It's also bringing him into a new world of fretless instruments. Also, I launched a new group at the IBMA festival this past week, Schultz's Dream, speaking about Arnold Schultz. And a lot of it, of course, Howard was one of the big engines driving me on thinking about Black secular music, and it's cross-sectioning between blues and country and jazz and ragtime, and I presented a series of numbers through that. So that was something recent that I just got to do. Had a nice full band.
Cool. I just finished up a book on Jelly Roll Morton and the earliest days of blues, based on his Library of Congress recordings, which I feel is one of the great documents of blues history, and nobody ever gives him that credit. And I sort of used it as a way to try to ask what was blues like before it was recorded, because Morton stopped playing blues around 1911. And so his memories are like this preserved in amber, what it was in the earliest period. So I just finished that book. And honestly, my other project is I've been doing a songobiography, just putting videos up online with some discussion, stories about each of the songs. And I just, the pandemic's over. I want to get out and start doing more gigs. So if anyone out there has suggestions, I'm ready to get on the road.
One last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a festival that's held every September in East Tennessee at Cove Lake State Park that's called the Louie Bluie Festival, that's named in honor of Howard Armstrong's nickname, and it tries to preserve his legacy and is a great place for people who want to jam together and then to hear music that you might not hear at your local pub. And so it's already passed for this year, but next September, if you and our audience, this is your first exposure to Howard Armstrong and you just can't get enough, you might want to plan a trip over to East Tennessee next fall.
Very good. Okay, I guess we're wrapping up now.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. This was great, and I really appreciate you all spending your time with us tonight. I've learned so much, and
Thank you.
Come back next year and tell us more. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.